A massive fleet of 500 warships loomed in space. Casting shadows over Earth, the Thraxians were a race of aliens known for their immense power and ruthless conquests. They had swept across the galaxy, claiming planet after planet, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Earth, with its relatively small military, was no match for their might. Or so the Thraxians thought. Humans had never faced anything like this before. Their enemies were advanced, with powerful energy weapons and near-invincible armor. Earth's forces were outnumbered and outdated, struggling to keep up with the technological advancements of other races. Most people on Earth feared that this would be their final battle. The thought of facing such a mighty enemy was terrifying. In a dark command center, Earth's leaders watched the approaching fleet on the screen, their faces filled with anxiety. They knew there was no way to win this battle. They had no choice but to surrender, but they refused to give up without one final attempt to defend their home. Earth's leaders debated what to do next, voices raised in desperation. "Maybe, if we send one ship, we can buy some time," said one of the generals. His voice was heavy with defeat. "It's a long shot, but it's the only option." "Send a ship?" One of the commanders scoffed. "You serious? We don't stand a chance." "We might not," replied the general. "But it's the only option left. Send a human ship to show the Thraxians we're not afraid." The room went silent. Everyone knew that this was a dangerous gamble, but they had no better choice. Across the room, John Sanders, a seasoned human officer, stood with his arms crossed, listening quietly to the conversation. John had seen battles before, many of them. He had fought for Earth for years, and every time the odds were stacked against him. But he was known for something else. He was fearless. John was no stranger to danger. He had always been the one to step up when others hesitated. And now, as the room looked to him for a solution, John finally spoke. "I'll take it," John said, his voice calm but determined. "Send me. I'll face them." His words shocked everyone in the room. Sending him into the heart of an enemy fleet with only a small ship would be madness. But John had always been known for doing the impossible. His reputation for outsmarting the enemy had earned him the respect of his fellow soldiers. John had a plan. It was risky, and it might not work, but it was the only chance they had. He knew that the Thraxians might be stronger, but they were also predictable. They relied too much on their advanced technology, and John had always believed that human ingenuity could outsmart the most powerful weapons. John didn't waste time. He left the command center and walked to the Valiant, a ship that had seen better days. It wasn't the newest or most advanced ship in the fleet, but it was still functional. And to John, that was all that mattered. The Valiant had a history just like him. It had been through battles and survived when others would have been destroyed. John stepped onto the ship, greeted by a small crew of experienced soldiers. They were just as nervous as he was, but they trusted him. They had seen John fight, and they knew that if anyone could survive this, it was him. "All right, team," John said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We've got one chance to make this work. Let's show them what humans can do." The crew nodded, the weight of the mission sinking in. They were about to face a fleet of 500 ships, and they were one of only a few human vessels left in the battle. As John sat in the pilot seat, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. But he wasn't afraid. He had been in tight situations before. This was just another challenge to overcome. As the Thraxian fleet advanced, John powered up the Valiant's engines. He knew that the odds were stacked against them, but he wasn't about to back down. The Thraxians had made one big mistake. They had underestimated humanity. "Let's show them we're not so easy to defeat," John muttered. Under his breath, the Thraxians had already begun their attack. Their ships fired powerful blasts of energy, tearing through the human defenses. But John didn't panic. He had expected this. With quick calculations and precise movements, he steered the Valiant away from the blasts, narrowly avoiding the energy waves that would have destroyed a lesser ship. He knew this wasn't a fight he could win with brute force, but it was one he could win with skill. As the battle raged around him, John kept his focus. The Thraxians were powerful, yes, but they were predictable. Their ships moved in a straight line, their weapons were slow to recharge, and their tactics were rigid. John used these weaknesses to his advantage. Nice target practice, John muttered as he took down one of the smaller Thraxian ships. It exploded in a burst of flames, the first sign that the Thraxians were starting to realize they weren't facing an easy target. The battle was intense, and John's crew did their best to hold their ground. Every time a Thraxian ship closed in, John maneuvered the Valiant in unpredictable patterns, dodging their attacks and firing back with everything they had. They weren't going down without a fight. Hours passed, and the Thraxian fleet continued to press on. But with each passing minute, John and his crew were making more of a dent in the enemy's numbers. The Thraxians were starting to feel the pressure. Their confidence was beginning to crack. John smiled as he watched another Thraxian ship explode. "Nice target practice," he said again, this time with a touch of satisfaction in his voice. He knew that this was only the beginning. The Thraxians had underestimated humanity, and John was about to show them just how dangerous that mistake could be. This part sets up the tension of the battle, introduces the main character, and shows his confidence and tactical genius. Story is off to an exciting start with action and strategy, setting the stage for the rest of the story. Ask ChatGPT. The battle raged on, and John knew that time was running out. The Thraxian fleet was vast and powerful. Every second he spent dodging their attacks was another moment they closed in on Earth. But John wasn't about to give up, and the humans had always been known for their resourcefulness and creativity. He trusted that his crew and the Valiant could outsmart their enemies. "Keep your focus, everyone," John shouted over the coms to his crew. "We can't let up now. Every Thraxian ship we take down gives us a better chance to win." The crew members, though nervous, had learned to trust John's leadership. They had all seen him in action, and they knew he wasn't the type to back down. They worked together, using their limited resources to fight back the powerful Thraxian fleet as the Valiant zipped through space. The ship's systems were old, but John had made sure to upgrade them with every bit of technology humanity had developed. The Valiant's small size allowed it to outmaneuver the larger Thraxian ships. But John also used the ship's unpredictable movement patterns to confuse the enemy. He had no illusions about the power of the Thraxian fleet, but he knew that they were not used to fighting against something so unpredictable. Suddenly, the alarm blared in John's ear. A Thraxian battleship had locked onto them, and its weapons were charging up for a massive blast. It was only a matter of moments before the ship would unleash its full force. "Brace for impact," John yelled as he pulled the ship into a sharp turn, hoping to evade the incoming attack. The blast missed by mere inches, and John grinned. He had been close, but it was a victory nonetheless. He pushed the Valiant even harder, firing back at the Thraxian ship, causing sparks to fly from its hull. The Thraxians were not used to fighting like this. Their ships were massive and slow compared to the nimble humans. It was an advantage John intended to exploit, but John didn't have much time. The Thraxian fleet wasn't stupid. They had quickly adapted to his movements, and soon they sent out smaller ships to try and corner the Valiant. John couldn't allow that. He had to keep moving, stay unpredictable, and stay one step ahead. "Target the smaller ships," John commanded. "We need to take out the scouts before they regroup." The crew responded quickly, firing their weapons and taking out one of the smaller Thraxian ships.
Ow.
It exploded in a fiery ball, but John knew that they were still far from winning. The Thraxian fleet was growing smarter with every passing moment. John could see the pattern forming. They were trying to herd him into a trap. John's mind raced as he analyzed the situation. He needed to create confusion. He needed to force the Thraxians to break formation, to scatter. He had an idea. "Set the decoys," John ordered. "Get them ready." Crew quickly followed his command. A series of decoys were deployed, mimicking the Valiant's energy signature. These decoys would confuse the Thraxians, making it harder for them to track the real ship. If they took the bait, it would give John a few precious moments to escape and regroup. "Let's see how they handle this," John muttered to himself as he activated the decoys and sent them in multiple directions. The Thraxian fleet, following its instincts, immediately began to target the decoys. John could see the alien ships firing at the false targets, missing the Valiant as it slipped away. John used the distraction to close in on a few of the smaller Thraxian ships, his weapons, firing with pinpoint accuracy. He managed to destroy 2 more before the Thraxians realized what had happened. John was starting to feel the tide turning in their favor. The Thraxians had made a critical mistake by underestimating the humans. Their pride had led them to believe that sheer numbers and superior technology would win the battle. But John had proven that skill, strategy, and unpredictability were just as powerful. "All right, team, we're making progress," John said, keeping his voice calm but steady. "But don't get too comfortable. We need to keep the pressure on." Crew nodded and continued to fire back at the Thraxian fleet, following John's orders without hesitation. It was a dance of sorts. John moved in, struck fast, and then got out before the Thraxians could retaliate. The Thraxian fleet, now visibly disorganized, was losing its grip on the battle. Just as John was about to give another command, a Thraxian dreadnought appeared in front of him, blocking his path. It was one of the largest ships in their fleet. With weapons powerful enough to level entire cities, now John knew that the dreadnought would be difficult to take down, but he couldn't afford to waste time. He needed to strike before the dreadnought could fire its powerful energy cannon. "Full power to the engines. Let's go," John shouted as he pushed the Valiant forward. Narrowly avoiding the dreadnought's blast, the ship lurched forward, closing the distance between the Valiant and the dreadnought. John's hands flew over the controls, guiding the ship as it raced toward the massive enemy vessel. With a steady hand, John fired a series of precision shots at the dreadnought's weak spots. It took several hits, but eventually the dreadnought's shields began to crack, and John saw his chance. With a final, calculated move, John hit the dreadnought's main reactor, causing it to explode in a massive fireball that lit up the surrounding space. The explosion sent shockwaves through the battlefield, and John couldn't help but grin. He had done it. The Thraxians were starting to realize that their overwhelming numbers didn't mean anything if they couldn't stop the humans from outsmarting them. As the dreadnought crumbled, John looked up at the remaining ships. The Thraxians had lost their leader, and their fleet was beginning to fall apart. But John knew that they weren't out of danger yet. There were still too many ships, and the battle was far from over. "Keep your eyes open, everyone. This fight isn't over yet," John said, his voice steady but with a hint of determination. "Let's finish this." The battle continued, but for the first time since the Thraxians arrived, John felt like they were starting to win in this part. John's quick thinking and leadership allowed the humans to turn the tide of battle, gaining ground against the Thraxians. John's use of tactics and decoys showcases human ingenuity, and the tension builds as the battle intensifies. The battle continued to rage around John and his crew. The Thraxian fleet, now disoriented and losing ships, was not ready to admit defeat. John could see the growing panic among their ranks. The Thraxians, once confident in their overwhelming numbers and advanced technology, were starting to realize that the humans were not the easy target they had believed. John, however, wasn't about to slow down. He had a plan, and he was sticking to it. The Valiant had been upgraded with a few surprises, but the key to their success was John's ability to think on his feet. The Thraxians were used to battles with predictable tactics, but John knew that unpredictability was the key to winning. "Keep moving, keep them guessing," ordered, his voice calm and confident. He glanced at his crew, all of whom were working in unison with him, their hands flying over the controls, weapons firing with precision. The crew's confidence had grown since the beginning of the battle. They no longer saw themselves as underdogs. They were now a team, working together, following John's lead. His fearlessness inspired them to push past their doubts. The Thraxians weren't giving up easily, though. The larger warships fired their weapons in a coordinated attack, sending deadly energy blasts toward the Valiant. But John anticipated their moves. He veered the ship sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding the oncoming blast. "Nice try," John muttered as he fired back, hitting one of the smaller Thraxian ships. The explosion lit up the dark expanse of space, a small victory for the humans. John's heart raced as the battle wore on. The Thraxians were now firing in waves, sending countless ships in all directions, hoping to trap him in a corner. John wasn't fooled. He saw through their plan. The Thraxians were trying to force him into a predictable pattern, and if he played into that, it would be over. Focus on the middle, John barked to his crew. If we break their center, we break their morale. The crew responded immediately, taking aim at the heart of the Thraxian formation. John's strategy was working. The Valiant was small enough to slip through the gaps between enemy ships, firing at the weakest points and taking down ship after ship. The Thraxians, now disorganized and desperate, were scrambling to regroup, but it was too late. They were already losing too many ships. A sudden burst of static interrupted John's focus. He frowned and tapped the communication panel. A Thraxian officer's voice crackled through, filled with static. "You are a fool human," the officer said, his voice low and angry. "You cannot win. Our fleet is unstoppable. You will fall." Just like all the others, John couldn't help but smirk. The Thraxians still didn't understand. They believed that their numbers and firepower were enough to crush anyone who dared to stand in their way. But they hadn't counted on the human will to survive, the ability to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. "We'll see about that," John replied coolly. "Keep your eyes on your own fleet, Thraxian. We're coming for you." John knew this wasn't the end. The Thraxians might be rattled, but they still had their pride and their power. They wouldn't give up without a fight. John was ready to bring the fight to them. The Valiant danced around the battlefield, taking out one ship after another. The smaller Thraxian vessels were no match for John's tactics. But the larger, more heavily armored warships were a different story. These ships had shields and weapons that could wipe out smaller targets in one shot. John needed to outsmart them, not just outfight them. Full power to the engines. "We're going straight through them," John ordered. The crew hesitated for a moment, unsure of the plan, but John's steady voice reassured them. They had followed his lead through countless close calls. They trusted him now more than ever. The Valiant surged forward, heading straight for the largest of the Thraxian warships. The Thraxians, believing they had caught John in a trap, unleashed everything they had. John could feel the energy blasts shaking the ship, but he held his course. They were close now. It's too close for the Thraxians to react. Now John shouted. At his command, the Valiant suddenly pulled up, diving beneath the Thraxian warship at the last second. The energy blasts from the Thraxian ship passed harmlessly overhead, missing the Valiant by mere inches. The crew cheered as John hit the thrusters, sending the ship rocketing toward the Thraxian ship's underbelly. "Target the reactor," John ordered. The crew worked quickly, firing at the weak spots of the Thraxian ship's underside. The blasts hit their mark, and the massive warship began to tremble. Within seconds, the ship's reactor exploded in a flash of blinding light, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The explosion rocked space, and John could see the ripple effect as other Thraxian ships faltered. Their formations shattered, their communication systems scrambled. For the first time, the Thraxians were unsure of themselves. The confidence that had once filled their ranks had been replaced with doubt. They had underestimated the humans. "We've got them on the ropes now," John said, his voice filled with calm satisfaction. But John knew that victory wasn't certain yet. The Thraxians would regroup, and they would fight back harder than ever. John couldn't afford to make a mistake. He had to finish this now, while the enemy was still reeling from the loss of their largest warship. "Everyone, stay sharp," John reminded his crew. "We're not done yet." John's plan was coming together. The Thraxian fleet was beginning to fall apart, their ranks thinning as more ships were destroyed. But John knew better than to get overconfident. Thraxians were a proud and determined enemy. They would not go down easily. As John and his crew continued to battle, the Thraxian fleet began to retreat, but they were not ready to give up the fight. John wasn't done with them yet, though. He had made his move, and he wasn't about to let the Thraxians escape without seeing just how strong humans could be. This part builds on the tension from the earlier parts of the story, showing John's strategic thinking and the crew's growing confidence. It also highlights the Thraxians' changing attitudes as they begin to realize that the humans are not the easy target they thought they were. The action-packed battle continues, with John continuing to outsmart and defeat the Thraxian fleet. Ask ChatGPT. The Thraxians were starting to realize that their victory was slipping away. Their once mighty fleet had been reduced, bit by bit, under the relentless assault from John and his crew. The shockwaves from the explosion of their flagship still rippled through the remaining ships, causing confusion and panic. But John knew this wasn't the time to relax. The Thraxians weren't beaten yet. They were regrouping, preparing for one final push. John had no intention of letting them recover. "Stay alert, everyone," John said, as he surveyed the battlefield from the cockpit of the Valiant. His fingers danced over the controls as he guided the ship in tight circles, dodging incoming fire and responding with his own blasts. He could feel the tension in the air, not just from his crew, but from the very ships around them. The Thraxians were angry now, and when they were angry, they were dangerous. The battle had taken its toll. Many of the smaller human ships had already been destroyed, and the Valiant was one of the few remaining fighters still standing. John could see the other human ships scattered across the battlefield, trying their best to keep the Thraxians at bay. But even with their combined efforts, the humans were still outnumbered. "We've got a big one coming up," John muttered, watching as a large Thraxian warship closed in on the Valiant. The ship was massive, its dark metal surface gleaming with threat. It was unlike any of the ships John had faced so far, bristling with weapons and shielded by powerful armor. This was the Thraxians' last hope, their ace in the hole. John didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle forward, speeding directly toward the oncoming warship. His crew gasped in surprise. But John had a plan. The Thraxian warship, despite its strength, was predictable. It would try to overpower them with sheer force, but John had learned its weaknesses. "Target the engines," John ordered. The crew responded immediately, their hands working together in perfect harmony. They fired several shots at the warships. Engine block, striking the weak points John had identified during his earlier attacks. The warship shook, but it didn't go down. The Thraxians fired back with full force, energy blasts that rocked the Valiant to its core. John gritted his teeth as he steered the ship with expert precision, narrowly avoiding the incoming fire. "We can't take much more of this," one of the crew members shouted, panic creeping into their voice. John's mind raced. He knew the ship was old, but he also knew it was built to last. He wasn't about to let the Thraxians win. They were underestimating humans, underestimating him, and that was the mistake they would pay for. Full power to the shields. John commanded, his voice steady. The crew quickly followed his orders, boosting the shields to their maximum. The Thraxians' energy blasts hit them with full force, but the Valiant held strong. The ship groaned under the pressure, but it wasn't breaking. "Take that, you overgrown metal bucket," John shouted as he launched another round of shots directly at the Thraxian warship's engine. This time, the shots hit their mark. The engine sputtered, and the massive warship began to slow. John didn't waste a second. He immediately took advantage of the opening. The Valiant darted in close, moving at breakneck speed. The Thraxians fired their weapons again, but John was ready. He activated the ship's thrusters, pulling them into a sharp, almost impossible turn. The energy blasts missed by inches. The Thraxian warship, now losing power, tried to turn and escape. But it was too late. John's crew hit the warship's reactor, sending it into a violent explosion. The blast lit up the space around them as the Thraxian ship shattered into thousands of pieces, its remains floating in a fiery cloud. "That's one down," John said, a smirk crossing his face. "Now, let's take out the rest." The Thraxians, now realizing that their prized warship was destroyed, began to panic. John's crew was breathing heavily, but John knew they had to keep moving. The Thraxians were already regrouping, trying to form new attack patterns. They wouldn't give up without a fight, but John wasn't going to make it easy for them. "Switch to evasive maneuvers," John ordered. "We need to keep them guessing." As the Thraxians launched a new wave of attacks, the Valiant danced across the battlefield, ducking and weaving between debris and other ships. The Thraxians tried to keep up, but their movements were stiff and predictable. John used this to his advantage, picking off ships one by one. His crew worked quickly, firing at the Thraxian ships with precision, but John knew they couldn't win this fight by simply taking out small ships. They needed to break the Thraxian leadership, to take out their command ships. That's where the real power lay. If they could take out the commanders, the rest of the fleet would fall apart. John looked around the battlefield. There near the back of the Thraxian formation was a massive command ship. It was well protected by a ring of smaller ships. But John knew that this was their target. If they could destroy it, the Thraxian fleet would lose its direction. "Prepare for one final push," John said, his voice filled with determination. "We're going for the command ship." The crew, exhausted but determined, nodded. They had already fought so hard, they weren't about to stop now. The Valiant broke through the Thraxian line, moving toward the command ship with incredible speed. John could see the enemy ships trying to regroup, but they were too slow. John fired at the smaller ships surrounding the command ship, taking them down one by one. He could see the fear beginning to spread among the Thraxians. Their fleet was falling apart. Their pride was shattered. I had no intention of letting them regroup. As they got closer to the command ship, John's fingers flew over the controls. He fired a series of devastating shots at the ship's weak points. The blasts hit, and the Thraxian command ship began to break apart, its shields cracking. Under the pressure, the explosion that followed was unlike any John had seen before. The command ship erupted in a burst of fire and light, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The Thraxians had lost their leadership, and now their entire fleet was in chaos. John looked at the wreckage in front of him, his heart pounding. They had done it. "Good work, team," John said, his voice full of pride. "We've won this one." The Thraxians, now leaderless and in disarray, began to retreat. The once mighty fleet was no longer a threat. John's crew let out a collective sigh of relief. They had done what seemed impossible. They had beaten the Thraxians. And it was all thanks to their teamwork, their will to survive, John's leadership. But John knew this was just the beginning. The battle was won, but the war was far from over in this part. John's tactics and leadership allow his crew to take down a massive Thraxian warship and then break through to target their command ship. This part sets up the turning point in the battle, showing how John's strategic thinking and determination lead to the collapse of the Thraxian. The explosion from the Thraxian command ship had left a massive scar on the battlefield. The light from the blast had illuminated the vastness of space, turning the dark void into a bright spectacle for a brief moment. But the chaos didn't end with the destruction of their leadership. The Thraxians, now scattered and confused, were trying to regroup, but John knew that the victory wasn't complete yet. There was still a battle to finish. John looked out through the cockpit of the Valiant, watching as the Thraxian fleet began to falter. Ships that were once organized and powerful were now stumbling, lost in disarray. They hadn't expected a human ship to strike at their heart, and now they were paying for their arrogance. "All right, everyone," John said, his voice calm but determined. "Don't get too comfortable. We've won a battle, but the war isn't over yet. They'll regroup. We need to finish this." His crew nodded, their faces tired but resolute. They had seen their fair share of chaos during the battle, but now they were more determined than ever. They had seen what humans could do when pushed to their limits. The Thraxians had underestimated them from the start, and now they were paying the price. John glanced over at the remaining ships on the battlefield. The Thraxian fleet still had numbers, and even though their command ship was gone, they weren't done yet. The smaller ships, those that had been caught off guard by John's tactics, were beginning to regroup into new formations. They had learned their lesson, but John wasn't about to let them get back on track. "Prepare for another push," John ordered. "We're not letting them recover." The crew quickly got to work, preparing the Valiant for another assault. John knew that the Thraxians would be making a last-ditch effort to hold on to their power. They would send their most powerful ships at them, hoping that sheer force would break the humans. But John had no intention of letting that happen. He engaged. The engines and the Valiant surged forward, dodging incoming fire from the Thraxian ships. The smaller vessels tried to retaliate, but they were no match for the speed and agility of the human ship. John's quick thinking had already proven that the Thraxians were vulnerable. They had expected to win with their technology and numbers, But John had shown them that humans were far more than just easy targets. As they neared the Thraxian forces, John's eyes narrowed. There in the distance was the last remaining Thraxian dreadnought. It was their largest and most heavily armed ship, the pride of their fleet. If John could take it down, the remaining Thraxian ships would be left without any real leadership, and the battle would be over. "We're going after the dreadnought," John said, his voice full of purpose. The crew worked quickly, powering up the ship's weapons and shields. John pushed the Valiant forward, racing toward the giant Thraxian warship. The dreadnought fired first, massive energy blasts raining down on the Valiant, shaking the ship. John held tight to the controls, using every ounce of skill to avoid the incoming blasts. "This one's going to be tough," John said, his voice steady, but his mind racing. The dreadnought's shields were strong, and its weapons were devastating. But John had studied the Thraxians long enough to know that even their most powerful ships had weak points. He just had to find them. "Get ready," John shouted. With one quick movement, he jerked the controls, sending the Valiant into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding another barrage of fire from the dreadnought. The crew braced themselves, but John kept his focus. He could feel the sweat on his brow, but there was no time to be distracted. "We've got to hit their engines," John commanded. "If we take out their power, they won't be able to fire back." The crew worked fast, targeting the dreadnought's vulnerable engine core. John dodged more blasts, bringing the Valiant closer and closer to the massive ship. As they closed in, John fired a precise shot at the dreadnought's reactor, hitting the weak spot just beneath its heavily armored hull. The blast sent a shockwave through the battlefield, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The dreadnought's massive form was engulfed in a burst of fire, the explosion lighting up the space around them. John's heart raced as he watched the Thraxian warship crumble. John didn't let up. He knew that even with the dreadnought destroyed, there were still too many Thraxian ships left. But he also knew that they were now on the verge of winning. The Thraxians, shaken and leaderless, were starting to break apart. The human forces, though battered, had a renewed sense of hope. "Great shot!" one of the crew members shouted, a grin spreading across their face. The crew was starting to feel the thrill of victory. But John remained focused. There was no time for celebration yet. "We've got one last job to do," John said. "We finish them off. No mercy." The remaining Thraxian ships were regrouping, trying to form a last line of defense. But John and his crew weren't going to let them have the chance. With another sharp command, John ordered the Valiant to head straight into the heart of the Thraxian formation. The ship surged forward, dodging fire, and returning shots as they moved deeper into enemy lines. The crew was working as one every person on board knew what was at stake. This was it. This was the final push. John's hands were steady on the controls, guiding the Valiant through the storm of blasts. He could see the Thraxians growing more desperate. They were being picked apart by smaller human ships, unable to keep up with the fast and unpredictable attacks. John grinned as he targeted another Thraxian vessel, taking it out with a well-placed shot. "Keep it up," John shouted. "We've almost got them." One by one, the remaining Thraxian ships fell, their shields crumbling under the pressure. The tide had finally turned. John could feel it in the air. The victory was theirs. The Thraxian fleet, once so confident and unstoppable, was being reduced to nothing. John glanced at his crew. They were tired, but there was a fire in their eyes. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. "Humanity wins today," John said quietly, but with pride. "We show them that we're not to be underestimated." The last of the Thraxian ships finally surrendered, their fleet in tatters. The humans had won. Against all odds, they had turned the tide, and the Thraxians had been forced to retreat. John leaned back in his seat, letting out a deep breath. It was over. The battle was won, but John knew that this victory would echo across the galaxy. The humans had shown the Thraxians what they were truly capable of. In this part, John leads the crew in a final push to take down the last remaining Thraxian forces with a focus on destroying their dreadnought. The battle reaches its peak, and John's tactical brilliance and leadership bring the human forces to victory. The part captures the intensity of the battle and the pride of the humans as they triumph against overwhelming odds. The battle had been long, and the Thraxians were retreating. The once mighty fleet that had come to crush humanity had been scattered and broken. John and his crew watched in silence as the remnants of the Thraxian fleet slowly disappeared into the depths of space. The light from their explosions still glowed faintly in the distance. Marking the end of their reign of terror, John's hands were still gripping the controls of the Valiant. But his body felt heavy. The adrenaline that had fueled him during the battle was starting to fade, and he could feel the exhaustion setting in. He had led his crew through a battle that no one had expected them to survive, let alone win. But here they were, victorious.
Is
it really over?
Oh.
One of his crew members asked, her voice filled with disbelief. John glanced at her, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. For now, he said, "We've won today, but we need to keep watch. The Thraxians won't forget this." Easily, the crew had been through a lot. They had faced the full force of the Thraxian fleet, fought through overwhelming odds, and come out on top. But it wasn't just the battle they had won. They had proven something far more important. They'd proven that humanity was not weak. That even against the greatest of threats, they could fight back and emerge victorious. John looked out into the vastness of space, where the last of the Thraxian ships were retreating. The Thraxians were still a powerful force, and the galaxy would remember this battle. But the humans had made their mark. No one would underestimate Earth again. "All right," John said, breaking the silence. "Let's get back to Earth. We've got a lot to report." As the Valiant turned toward Earth, John took a deep breath. The battle was over, but there was still work to do. They had to prepare for the aftermath, for the possibility that the Thraxians might return one day, more prepared and more determined. John wasn't going to let that happen. The human race had to be ready. The journey back to Earth was quiet. The crew was exhausted, but there was a sense of pride in the air. They had done something no one had thought possible. The Thraxians had underestimated them, and now they would think twice before coming back. John spent most of the flight in the cockpit, staring out at the stars. It was hard to believe that just hours ago he had been fighting for humanity's survival now. Earth was safe for the moment, but John knew that peace was temporary. The galaxy was full of dangers, and humans had just made their first real mark on it as the Valiant entered Earth's atmosphere. John received a transmission from Earth's command center. The voice on the other end was filled with both relief and awe. "John, you did it. You and your crew saved us. The Thraxians are retreating, and the rest of their fleet is in disarray. You've proven that we're not to be underestimated." John smiled. "We did what we had to do," he said simply. "But we're not done yet. The Thraxians will be back. And next time, we need to be ready." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then the voice spoke again. "We're already working on it. This victory will change everything. We've seen what humans can do. We'll make sure Earth is prepared for whatever comes next." John nodded, even though he knew they couldn't be certain of what the future held. But for now, humanity had won, and that was enough. The ship touched down, and as John stepped out of the cockpit, he was greeted by his crew. Their faces were tired but filled with pride. They had fought side by side, and they had come out victorious. They had done the impossible. John looked at them, his heart swelling with pride. "We did it," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "But this is just the beginning. We've shown them what humanity is capable of. Now, we have to make sure they never forget." The crew nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The battle was over. But the war for Earth's survival was far from finished. As the crew left the Valiant and entered the debriefing room, John couldn't help but think about the future. The galaxy was vast, and humanity was just beginning to make its mark. The Thraxians had learned a valuable lesson today, and John had no doubt that other races would be watching closely. They had proven that humans could stand up to the strongest of enemies, that they were capable of winning against all odds. John knew that there would be challenges ahead. The Thraxians wouldn't be the last alien race to try and conquer Earth, But he also knew that humanity had something that no one else had, the ability to fight back, to outthink their enemies, and to survive. And for the first time in a long time, John felt hopeful. The future might be uncertain, but humanity had a chance. They had proven that they were not weak. They had proven that they were strong. "Let's get ready for the next challenge," John said to his crew as they sat down to begin the debriefing, "because this is just the start." The crew gathered around, their faces filled with determination. They had come together to fight a common enemy, and they had one. But now, they had to prepare for whatever the galaxy had in store for them next. John looked around the room at his team. He knew that they were ready. Together, they had done the impossible. And together, they would face whatever came next. In this part, John and his crew returned to Earth after their hard-fought victory. And John reflects on the importance of the battle and the future challenges that lie ahead. The humans' victory against the Thraxians marks a turning point, with the crew realizing that this is just the beginning of humanity's journey in the galaxy. The tone is reflective, yet hopeful, as John understands that humanity must continue to fight for its place in the stars.